everyone. I am Maynard Bigayo. I am the 10th and the last reporter for the topic 3. So my report focused on psychological report. So in my report, we will know what is psychological report. So ano nga ba ang psychological report? So sabi dito, psychological report is the end product of assessment. It represents the clinician's efforts to integrate the assessment data into a functional whole so that the information can help the client solve problems and make decisions. So even the best tests are useless unless the data from them is explained in a manner that is relevant and clear and meets the needs of the client and referral source. The high reliability or validity of a test or assessment procedure may be caused to the wind if the assessment report is written in an organized and readable fashion. Of course, what constitutes an organized and readable report will vary as a function of a goal of the assessment and the audience for whom the report is intended. Psychological reports may be as different as the reasons for undertaking the assessment. The manner of presentation is used depends on the purpose for which the report is intended, as well as on the individual style and orientation of the practitioner. Some basic elements are common to most psychological reports, and learning how to write one is necessary skill in educational, organizational, and other settings, or any setting where psychological assessment takes place. So, dito sa psychological report, meron tayong mga elements of typical psychological report. So, according dito, there is no single agreed on format to exist, as long as every report should integrate old information as well as provide new and unique information. So the first element of typical psychological report is the demographic data. Included here are all or some of the followings: the patient's name, address, telephone number, education, occupation, religion, marital status, date of birth, place of birth, ethnic membership, citizenship, and date of testing. The examiner's name may also be listed with such identifying materials. So the second element for a typical psychological report is reason for referral. So under this are the reasons why was this patient referred for psychological assessment. If all relevant background information is not covered in the reason for referral section of the report, it may be covered in a separate section labeled background or in later section labeled findings. So the third element is test administered. Here, the examiner simply lists the names of the tests that were administered along with the date or date that each test on the list was administered. Let's proceed to the fourth element, which is the findings. Here, the examiner reports not only findings but also all extra test considerations, such as observations concerning the examinee's motivation, the examinee's level of fatigue, the nature of the relationship and rapport with the examiner, indices of anxiety, and method of approach to the task. The section labeled findings may begin with a description that is detailed enough for the reader of the report also or almost to visualize the examinee. So also included in this section is mention of any extraneous variables that might be in some way have affected the test results. The findings section of the report is where all the background materials, behavioral observations, and test data are integrated to provide an answer to the referral question. Whether or not the examinee makes reference to the actual test data is a matter of personal preference. Ideally, the findings section should lead logically into recommendation section. So dito na siya, dapat daw ang findings is mag-lead siya into recommendation section because the fifth element is recommendation. So, On this section, on the basis of psychological assessment with particular attention to factors such as personal aspects and deficiencies of the examinee. Recommendations addressed to ameliorating the presenting problem are given. The recommendation may be for psychotherapy, a consultation with a neurologist, placement in special class, short-term family therapy addressed to a specific problem, whether the examiner believes is required to ameliorate the situation is spelled out here. So the last element is summary. The summary section includes in short form statement concerning the reason for referral, the findings, the recommendation. This section is usually only a paragraph or two, and it should provide a concise statement of who the examiner is, why the examiner was referred for testing, and what was found and what needs to be done. So yan yung mga elements of a typical psychological report. Okay. On this section, i-discuss ko naman kung ano ang mga guidelines in writing psychological report. So we have length, style, presenting task interpretation, topics, deciding what to include, emphasis, use of raw data, terminology, content overload, and feedback. So the first guideline that I will be discussing is the length. So the typical psychological report is between 5 and 7 single-spaced pages. So according to Finn, Mose, and Kaplan 2001. So however, the length can vary substantially based on the purpose of the report, context, and expectations of the referral source. In medical context, a 2-page report is not uncommon. This parallels the format for many physicians' reports that are similar length. In contrast, legal contexts often require reports that are from 7 to 10 pages because of the greater need for documentation combined with more extensive referral questions. So, dito sa length is, hindi din siya nakaspecify kung gaano lang ba kadami yung pages or kahaba ang laman ng isang psychological report. It depends din kung gaano sa physician or sa examiner kung gaano karami ang information na ilalagay niyo doon sa psychological report and nakadepende din yun sa cases ng kanyang client. So the next guideline is the style or flavor of a report is influenced primarily by the training and orientation of the examiner. The clinician can choose from 4 general report writing approaches, which are literary, clinical, scientific, and professional. So each style has unique strengths and all have number of liabilities. So first, let's discuss kung ano ba ang literary approach. So literary approach uses everyday language, is creative and often dramatic. Although it can effectively capture a reader's attention and provide colorful descriptions, it is often imprecise and prone to exaggeration. So yan yung literary approach. So next, what is clinical approach? So the clinical approach focuses on the pathological dimensions of a person. It describes the clinician's abnormal features, defenses, dynamics involved in maladjustment, and typical reaction to stress. The strength of the clinical approach is that it provides information about areas in need of change and alerts a potential practitioner to likely difficulties during the course of treatment. However, such a report tends to be done one-sided in that it may omit important strengths of person. Although most clinical reports should describe a person's problem areas, This problem area should be given appropriate emphasis on the context of the client's relevant strengths and resources. So yun yung clinical approach. So the next is the scientific approach. The scientific approach of report writing emphasizes normative comparisons, tends to be more academic to a lesser extent, relates to the nature of a client's pathology. The scientific style differs from other two approaches, chiefly in its reference to concepts, theories, and data. It looks and describes test findings in an objective, factual manner. So, ang scientific approach daw is, um, it is really describing the findings in an objective and a factual manner. So, the last approach or style is professional style. So, owned by 1997, stresses that the most important style to use in report writing is what he refers to as professional style, because this is characterized by short words that are of common usage and that have precise meanings. Grammatically, writers should use a variety of sentence constructions and length to maintain readers' interest. However, in actual practice, it is unusual to find a pure example of a literary, clinical, or scientific report. Clinicians generally draw from all three approaches, but typically emphasize one. An important part of effective report writing is the ability to evaluate the assets and limitations of each style, and to maintain a flexible orientation toward appropriately combining them. Above all, avoid the pitfalls associated with specializing in any one of these styles and to emphasize instead their relative strength. So the next game is the presenting test interpretation. So here, the hypothesis-oriented model focuses heavily on answering specific questions asked by the referral source. A domain-oriented report discusses the client in relation to specific topics such as cognitive abilities, interpersonal relationships, vocational abilities, or sexuality. This approach is comprehensive and indicates the client's strengths and weaknesses and typically gives the reader a good feel for a person as a whole. The referral question is still answered but is addressed by responding to specific domains relating to the referral question. The report tends to be highly focused, well integrated, and avoids any extraneous material. So the next is the topics. So this is an extremely wide range of topics or domains that clinicians may decide to discuss in their reports. So this topic serves as a conceptual tools that enable report writers to give form and direction to the information they are trying to communicate. Highly focused reports may elaborate on one or two significant areas of functioning, whereas a more general evaluation may discuss 7 or 8 relevant topics. So, in Table 15, so this is a representative list of topics that may be considered for inclusion in an evaluation. This list is by no means complete but can provide general guidelines for the wide range of possible topics from which a report writer can choose. So, ito daw yung mga possible topics na can be included in writing psychological report. So the next guideline is deciding what to include. So the general purpose of psychological evaluation is to provide information that will be most helpful in responding to the referral question and meeting the needs of the client. In this context, the clinicians must strike a balance between providing too much information and providing too little, and between being too cold and being too dramatic. As a rule, information should be included only if it serves to increase the understanding of the client. The basic guidelines for deciding what to include in a report relates to the needs of referral setting, background of the readers, purpose of the testing, relative usefulness of the information, and whether the information describes unique characteristics of the person. So the next is the emphasis. Careful consideration should be given to appropriate emphasis of conclusion, particularly when indicating the relative intensity of a client's behavior. So improper emphasis can reflect an incorrect interpretation, of course, by the examiner. And this misinterpretation is then passed down to the readers. Misinterpretations can also result from vague and ambiguously worded sentences that place incorrect or misleading emphasis on clients' behavior. So dapat, when writing a psychological report, so you just need to emphasize the important details, important informations, and of course, para hindi siya maging vague or ambiguous when the client reads it or when the court reads that psychological report. So the next guideline is the use of raw data. When writing the impression and interpretation section, report writers should generally avoid adhering too closely to the raw data. For certain purposes, however, it may be useful to include raw data or even to describe the tests themselves. So sabi dito, it should be generally avoid adhering or when writing a interpretation daw is at least we must try to avoid adhering closely to the raw data. But in some point, it is useful naman daw to include raw data or even to describe the tests themselves because the purpose of providing raw data and behavioral descriptions is to enrich and illustrate the topic and that to enable the reader to follow Clinician's line for reasoning or document the inferences that have been made. So next is the terminology. So there are several arguments have been made in determining whether to use technical or non-technical language in psychological reports. It might be argued that technical terminology is precise and economical, increases credibility of the writer, and can communicate concepts that are impossible to convey through non-technical language. However, number of potential difficulties are often encountered with the use of technical language. One of the more frequent problems involved in varying backgrounds and levels of sophistication of the person reading the report. Also, the clients themselves have access to and read the report. So, Clover stresses that any description found in a psychological report should be comprehensible to any literate person of at least average intelligence. So the next is the content overload. So there is no specific rules to follow in determining how much information to include in a report. A general guideline is to estimate how much information a reader can realistically be expected to assimilate. If too many details are given, the information may begin to become poorly defined and vague, and therefore lack impact or usefulness. The clinician should instead adequately develop each of the various points and focus on the areas that are most relevant to the purpose of the report. So psychological report are not necessarily have an overload content or information. So the best psychological report is just emphasizing the important details, information, and of course, the findings and the results of the clients. So the last guideline is the feedback. So during the earlier days of psychological assessment, examiners often keep the result of psychological assessment carefully concealed from the client. So there was often an underlying belief that the results were too complex and mysterious for the client to adequately understand. In contrast, current practices are to provide the client with clear, direct, and accurate feedback regarding the result of an evaluation. The extent to which a clinician providing feedback will allow client to actually read all portions of the report varies. So the rationale for allowing the client to actually read the report is that doing so enables the client to experience the product of assessment in a direct manner. It also enables a practitioner to explain any areas that are unclear. So dito sa feedback, it really helps the client din para mas maintindihan niya kung ano pa talaga yung naging findings and naging result na kanyang assessment. Kasi some clients is hindi naman talaga binabasa or just not merely reading the content of the psychological report. So with that feedback, magkakaroon siya ng hint and idea and curiosity no, para basahin ang kanyang psychological report because of the information na binigay ng clinicians or nag-feedback ng clinicians sa client. So it really helps the clients to really understand the result of his assessment, and of course, it really urged the client to really read his psychological report. So, yan lang po ang aking report, which is psychological report. Ayan po mga elements and guidelines na dapat natin tandaan when we are writing and making psychological report kasi nga in the future gagawa din tayo nun. So, these are my references. Thank you very much and I hope you learn.